This was supposed to be his downfall. The moment he was exposed, cornered, forced to backtrack. The host came prepared to humiliate JD Vance on live television. But by the time it was over, the entire studio sat in stunned silence because they never expected what happened next. The air in the studio was thick with anticipation, the kind that wasn't just felt, it was crafted, carefully engineered through pre-interviews, producer notes, and a panel already aligned with the host's agenda. JD Vance could sense it the moment he stepped into the building. From the tight smiles of the staff to the way the panelists avoided direct eye contact, it was clear. This wasn't a discussion. It was a setup. The trap had already been laid. And the man setting it? Elliot Graves, a seasoned journalist with decades in the industry, known for cornering guests, particularly conservatives, until they either stumbled, backtracked, or lost their temper. That was the game. Frame the narrative, control the conversation, win. But tonight, JD Vance wasn't here to play along. The studio was cold, both in temperature and atmosphere. The lighting was clinical, too bright, too sharp. Vance sat down across from Graves, who was already leaning back in his chair. Smug, comfortable, already in control. "Senator Vance," Graves began, stretching out his name like it was the punchline to a joke. "Let's not waste time. A lot of people are saying you've completely changed, sold out even, that you're no longer the man who wrote Hillbilly Elegy, but just another politician bending the knee to Trump." A pause, a smirk. "So let's get right to it. Who's really pulling the strings? You or him?" There it was, the first move. A question not designed for an answer, but for an admission of guilt. The goal was simple. Corner JD into either defending Trump outright or appearing weak by distancing himself. Either way, Graves would have his soundbite. But Vance didn't blink. Instead, he let the silence stretch, just a little too long for comfort. Then with a measured inhale, he leaned forward slightly. "That's an interesting way to start an interview," he said, voice smooth, deliberate. "I have to wonder, did you come up with that question yourself, or was it handed to you in the producer's notes?" The first counterpunch landed. A ripple of movement passed through the studio. The panelists shifted in their seats. The control room went silent. The audience tensed. And Graves? His smirk twitched, just for a fraction of a second. Graves let out a short, forced chuckle. "Senator, you didn't actually answer the question?" He leaned in, pressing the moment. "It's a simple one. Are you your own man, or are you just another politician afraid of upsetting Donald Trump?" Another trap, a question that demanded a yes or no, but either answer would still serve Graves' narrative. But Vance wasn't playing defense. Not tonight. He tilted his head slightly, taking his time. "Elliot, it's funny. You talk about people being controlled, yet every time a Republican sits in this chair, the questions are always the same." He gestured subtly. "It's never about policies, never about real issues. It's about labels, about trying to put people in a box so you don't actually have to debate them." The shift in the room was almost imperceptible. A few panelists glanced at each other. The audience leaned in. JD wasn't playing defense. He was flipping the script. Graves needed to hit harder. He adjusted his position, straightened his notes. If the direct attack didn't work, he needed to push a different narrative. He forced a polite smile. "But let's be honest, Senator. You built your career criticizing the very people you now align with. You called Trump an idiot once, and now you defend him at every turn." He paused for dramatic effect. "So I'll ask again, who are you really? Or do you just say whatever your voters want to hear?" This was supposed to be the moment JD stumbles. Instead, he leans back, eyes locked onto Graves. Calm, collected, in control. "That's a great soundbite, Elliot." A pause. "Should I expect it in a CNN headline tomorrow? Maybe something like, 'Vance refuses to answer tough questions'? Because that's how this works, right?" The studio was silent. You push a narrative, cut the context, and hope no one actually listens to the conversation. The balance of power had shifted. For the first time, Graves hesitated. He shifted in his seat, adjusted his tie. The camera caught his fingers tapping against the desk. An unconscious tell. The producers offstage knew it too. Vance wasn't just answering the question. He was exposing the entire playbook. Graves forced a smirk, but it wasn't quite right. Well, Senator, that's certainly one way to look at it. It's the only way that's honest, JD responded without missing a beat. Another pause. Graves exhaled sharply. For the first time in his career, he was out of moves. The segment ended, but the energy in the room lingered. The producers whispered among themselves, deciding how to spin it. The panelists avoided eye contact with Graves, as if silently acknowledging what just happened. And JD Vance? He stood up, unshaken. Later that night, the clip went viral. Some called it a masterclass in handling media traps. Others accused Vance of dodging, spinning, manipulating. But the truth was clear. The trap failed, and people noticed. Final thought. The reality is simple. People like Elliot Graves don't ask questions to get answers. They ask questions to trap you, to control you. But respect isn't given. It's taken. And the moment you refuse to play their game, that's when you've already won. Graves exhaled slowly, the edges of his smirk fraying. This wasn't how the interview was supposed to go. JD Vance had been brought here to defend himself, to squirm under the weight of his own contradictions, to play the part of the apologetic politician caught between loyalty and logic. But instead, he sat there, unshaken, unmoved, unapologetic. Graves had spent years perfecting his approach, the calculated smirk, the tone that danced between condescension and amusement, the slow, patient pauses that let his words linger just long enough to sink into the minds of viewers at home. None of it was working. He glanced at the control booth just for a second. It was barely noticeable, but JD caught it. Graves was looking for an out, and JD knew, once the host starts looking for an escape route, the battle is already over. But Graves wasn't done. Not yet. He shuffled the papers in front of him, a deliberate move, a reset. His voice dropped into something softer, more reasonable, a trap disguised as a conversation. All right, Senator, let's step away from Trump for a moment. Let's talk about credibility, because a lot of people are asking, who is the real JD Vance? JD gave a slow, measured blink. Here we go. You were once one of Trump's biggest critics, Graves continued, his tone casual, almost friendly. You called him unfit for office. You warned about what he would do to the Republican Party. Another pause. And yet here you are, one of his most loyal defenders. So tell me, was that first version of JD Vance the real one? Or is it the one sitting in front of me now? The audience tensed. This was it, the moment Graves had been waiting for. If JD backtracked, he was a flip-flopper. If he doubled down, he was a hypocrite. It was supposed to be a checkmate. But JD, he barely even blinked. He exhaled through his nose, a soft chuckle escaping. You know, Elliot, it's funny. You sit here acting like you're exposing some deep contradiction, like you've cracked the code and I'm about to confess that I've been lying to everyone this whole time. He leaned in slightly, elbows resting on the chair's armrests. But the truth is simpler than you want to admit. Graves raised an eyebrow, waiting. JD smiled, just barely. I was wrong. The room went still. Graves blinked. The response caught him off guard. This wasn't the usual political deflection. JD wasn't running from it. He was owning it. I criticized Trump. I misunderstood him. I didn't believe he could actually deliver what he promised. And I was wrong. Another pause, JD glanced toward the panelists on the side of the set. You all act like changing your mind is some kind of crime. Like recognizing when you were mistaken makes you untrustworthy. But I think the real question is, why is admitting when you're wrong considered a weakness instead of a sign of growth? Graves' smirk flickered, barely there, but JD saw it. The game had shifted. This was supposed to be the moment where JD squirmed. Instead, he had turned the gun around. Graves adjusted in his seat, forced another smirk. So you're saying you changed because it was politically convenient? JD shook his head slightly, almost pitying the attempt. I changed my mind because I saw the results. His voice stayed steady, even, controlled. Trump did things other Republicans only talked about. He fought battles they were too afraid to take on. And I watched and I learned. And the people I care about, the working class families in this country, got results. So yeah, I changed my mind. A pause. Tell me, Elliot, when was the last time you changed yours? The studio went silent. Graves blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he was on the receiving end of his own game. JD didn't move, didn't fill the silence. He let it stretch. The producers were scrambling now. In the control booth, the director was already signaling, wrap it up, move on, cut to commercial. Graves straightened in his chair, masking his frustration behind a forced chuckle. Well, Senator, that's certainly one way to look at it. JD tilted his head slightly. It's the only way that's honest. Another beat of silence. Graves inhaled, forcing a smooth transition. We'll have to leave it there. The cameras cut to a wide shot. The studio lights dimmed slightly. The segment was over, but everyone watching knew the truth. As JD Vance stood up, the energy in the studio didn't dissipate. It just changed. The producers were whispering to each other. The panelists were already drafting their post-show spin. And Graves? He was still sitting there, staring down at his notes, tapping a pen against the desk. He had lost control. He knew it. JD knew it. And worst of all, the audience knew it. Later that night, the clip exploded online. Some called it a masterclass in handling media traps. Others accused JD of dodging, spinning, manipulating. But the truth was clear. Graves set a trap, and JD walked right through it, untouched. The moral, respect isn't given, it's taken. The next morning, JD scrolled through the reactions. Some praised him, some attacked him, but he didn't care. Because the people who needed to see it, saw it. And the people who wanted him to fail, watched him win. He set his phone down, leaned back in his chair, and exhaled. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Final thought. The reality is simple. People like Elliot Graves don't ask questions to get answers. They ask questions to trap you, to control you. But respect isn't given. It's taken. And the moment you refuse to play their game, that's when you've already won.